Most of my adult life was spent in the period of the so-called Cold War. And that was the war between two superpowers, the USSR, now called Russia, and the United States. Still has the same name, America. In any event, there was, during this period, somebody thought of having a clock posted on many TV stations, and it was the 2 minutes to midnight clock. The idea being that somebody could press the wrong button and the 3,000 or 4,000 atomic bombs that both the USSR and the USA had aimed at each other would go off, and boom, that would be the end of the world, because there were enough bombs to destroy every major city in the world in the northern hemisphere. And so people like me thought, we should really move to South America or maybe New Zealand to avoid that risk. Well, then, like everything in history, the world changed. And the Soviet Union, all of a sudden, began to fall apart under the leadership of this guy, Gorbachev. For those who don't remember, he had kind of a red scar on his birthmark, I guess it would be called, on his forehead. And he might as well have been a CIA agent, because he declared something called perestroika. The idea was Russia will no longer suppress revolutions or rebellions by countries like Latvia or Estonia, Yugoslavia, any country that was opposed to being a part of the Soviet Union would be allowed to go their own way. Big change. And the result was that the Soviet Union fell apart and was replaced by the Russian Federation. Now, in the course of this, it was nothing short of amazing, because the Russian military, most of their equipment, millions of Kalashnikov machine guns were sold or given away. And there was a movie about that era called The Lord of War with Nicolas Cage. Well, the idea of the movie and the reality was that all these weapons were sent to Africa and other places where there were Marxist or Islamist rebels. And so, in a way, the world was destabilized by an awful lot of weapons going to these smaller countries. But from our point of view, I'm sorry to say this, but nobody really cared about what would happen in Africa or smaller countries in Asia. If they wanted to wipe each other out, who cares? There was peace between the great powers, and they call that the peace dividend. And I remember people talking about, now we can, instead of spending billions and billions on defense and weapons and atomic bombs, we can throw all that stuff out and build homes and schools and highways and infrastructure and help the poor. Hey, it was going to be a wonderful world. And I remember, I think there was a couple of years of peace. Now, the peace was in Europe and the USSA and the Russian part of Asia. But it didn't last long. What happened? Well, there was a civil war in Turkey. Then the Tamil Tigers were in Sri Lanka. And then there was the Gulf War in Iraq, and the USA took sides and and toppled Saddam Hussein. But in all these wars, the casualties were relatively small, and there certainly wasn't any threat of atomic weapons being used. But what people seem to forget is that the casualties, the war in Rwanda, which was essentially a civil war between two different tribes, took an amazing amount of casualty, an amazing amount of dead people, almost 1 million. And today we hear about 14 people being killed in a missile attack or something, but the world paid no attention to 1 million people dying. And then in Africa, in Eritrea, in Somalia, there were all kinds of battles and little minor, not minor, not minor for them, but the U.S. And Europeans just paid no attention to what was going on in these African countries, and the level of starvation and death and rapes was hundreds of times more than what's going on now. But, you know, I guess the white people just didn't give a hoot about what was going on in Africa. But there, from our point of view, there was a peace dividend. Nothing much was happening to us. And then at the same time, there was in Mindanao, the Muslims were taking over, and the Philippine army crushed them. Then there was the Tuaregs and the Ossetia in Georgia, and Somalia and Islam, and then FARC in Brazil and Colombia and Iraq, Liberia. There was a war. Then we had Slobodan Milosevic, or whatever his name was, in Croatia. The country of Serbia was putting down Kosovo Muslims, and the USA came to the aid of the Muslims. And then there was the war in Afghanistan. And then the Russians had a bit of trouble with the Chechens. And they put down the Chechen revolution. And there was stuff in Congo going. Well, the point of all this is that the peace dividend actually did exist for the Western powers, but not for other places. In Bangladesh, there was a Mayo movement. In Mexico, there was a communist revolution. In Nepal, there was a communist revolution. In Congo, many, many people died. And then, of course, there was the Somali pirates. So as you see from this brief resume of the history of what happened right after the fall of the Soviet Union, there were wars, but the vast majority of them were in Africa. And so that's what happened to the peace dividend up until recently. And now with this invasion by Russia, we're having a serious escalation that could erupt into the war, and nobody has as yet reinstated the clock about 2 minutes to midnight, but it looks like it's getting back to that era. So I guess the moral of this story and the end of this video is that there is no peace in the world. It would be nice if there was, but I guess as long as there are guns floating around by the millions, there's people who want to play with these toys of death. And my advice, if you're a young guy and your country is threatened with war, go somewhere else. Avoid problems. Maybe read my book called PT, and that will tell you how to lay low, go somewhere else, start your life new, and stay alive, survive. So that's our thought for today, and we'll see you tomorrow.